good afternoon and welcome to the lightning lunch session. These are a taster of topics that appear within our degree programmes. And this is the turn of public and environmental health. And this session is entitled The Disease Detectives, John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. If there's any questions you forget to ask, you can email outreach@ljmu.ac.uk or courses@ljmu.ac.uk. Just a final point, my name's Karen Foreman, I never said that. I work in the outreach team and I'd like to pass over to Graham Mitchell.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Graham Mitchell. My day job at Liverpool John Moores University is I am the programme leader for the BSc Environmental Health. But today's talk is going to touch on something that's really key for both environmental health and public health as well. Because what we're going to focus on today is a little bit of history. And we're going to focus on an event that's probably considered to be the start of public health epidemiology. And we'll try and link this into the current coronavirus pandemic as well. So epidemiology very basically is the study of people, the study of diseases and how they interact with people. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And as Karen said, it's going to focus on one particular incident. And this is the incident of John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. This is one of my favourite graphics in relation to public health. This is entitled King Cholera. And as you can see, the skeleton represents cholera and he's standing by a water pump. The reason for that will become clear in a little bit, hopefully. But we need to go back in time. We need to go back into the 1830s and we can look at cholera outbreaks in the UK. And it's about this time that we start to see outbreaks of cholera occurring, particularly in port cities, and London is particularly hard hit. Now, we'd known about outbreaks of cholera. They sort of started in India around about 1817, and they progressed across the world, across into Europe, and eventually into the UK. Very similar in a sense to coronavirus. We could plot its movements across the world, starting in China, hitting into some place like Iran, and then into Italy, the rest of Europe, and eventually into the UK. Obviously, coronavirus slightly different because it's only taken a few months for that to happen. Certainly with cholera, this has taken decades, but people knew it was coming. And whilst anybody could fall victim to cholera, it seemed that the people who were most affected, the people who suffered more, were the poor. And again, that kind of resonates with coronavirus. Anybody can get coronavirus, but it seems that people in deprived areas tend to be affected more often. And this is just a picture of what sort of London in the 1830s, around about that time, looked like. A lot of areas in London, this was slum housing. These were big slums in London. And as you can see there, the group of people there, they all probably lived in those buildings. Very cramped, very poor conditions, very close. The building just here is probably the outhouse. That's probably their toilet. And that would then empty into a cesspool. So there is no main drainage. When the toilet sort of flushes, it just goes into a pool, a tank, if you like, and then slowly sort of leaks away into the ground to get rid of all the matter, if you like. So very poor conditions, very unhygienic conditions, very little control of sanitation in these areas. Now, without being too graphic, we need to talk a little bit about cholera. The symptoms of cholera are sort of diarrhea and vomiting, very, very severe sort of diarrhea, what was known as like rice water. It was like a combination, if you sort of got rice and mix it with water, that's kind of what it looked like. And that leads to a very severe dehydration of the individual. Now, cholera can be quite quick. It takes anywhere between sort of 2 hours and 5 days for the symptoms to show. And this is what we call the incubation period, the time it takes for the disease to actually show up in the body and cause a reaction in the body. And if it's left untreated, it can be fatal within a few hours because Again, the body is getting rid of so much fluid, becoming so dehydrated so quickly, that causes a major shock to the body system. And from a number of cases, this is fatal. This is fatal. Now, of course, this is sort of the 1830s and 1840s. They didn't know what caused cholera. In fact, we didn't know that a bacteria caused cholera until 1854, sometime into the future. So what we have is a disease that we know causes certain symptoms, that we know is fatal to a significant number of people, but people have no idea what is causing it. Now, the main theory at the time was what they call miasma. And the theory is this, is that illness is linked to smell. And it's bad smells, that somehow whatever was causing cholera was linked to a smell. And if there were bad smells in an area, that's where you would get cases of cholera. And so you'd find that those areas that were worse affected were the poor areas, because that's where the bad smells were. If you were wealthy, you were able to live outside of those areas, cleaner, more ventilated houses, all those kind of things. So there were fewer bad smells, and therefore fewer cases of cholera actually occurred. So we've got this idea that it's bad smells that are causing the problem. And mixed into that, we get a dose of, a good dose of Victorian morals here. That, the poor themselves were immoral. That they were drunk, they were work shy, they didn't have good morals, and therefore they kind of brought this all upon themselves, and almost to an extent that the poor deserve this. They have caused this themselves. So that was the situation, and that was the prevailing situation in the UK at the time, and even people who were leading lights in the field of public health, guys like Edwin Chadwick, who wrote a very important report around sanitary conditions, believed that miasma was the cause. It was all about smell. And if you could reduce the smell, if you control the smell, you would control the disease. But this idea is challenged. And it's challenged by a guy called John Snow, a Dr. John Snow. And his logic was that the way that cholera is sort of expelled from the body, the link of sort of the diarrhea and the vomiting, somehow it's got to get into the body through sort of ingesting something. It can't just be getting it through smell. Now, John Snow also, it's important to note his background, because he's one of the first anaesthetists in the UK. Before he started his study into cholera, he was an expert, one of the leading experts in the UK around the use of ether as an anaesthetic. In fact, his claim to fame before cholera was that he'd actually given ether to Queen Victoria to enable her to give birth to one of her children. And he kind of knew about gases, and he dealt with gases, and he just didn't buy into this idea that a smell could cause a problem, and why someone would get ill and why someone wouldn't. So he decided that it was something else. And he hit on the idea, he thought maybe water. Maybe that's the common factor. Water is the way that cholera gets into the body. Now, the problem with having a theory of that is you've got to test it. So what Snow did is he waited till the next cholera outbreak, and it occurred in London in a place called Broad Street, which conveniently was near Snow's surgery. So Snow was local to this outbreak. He knew this area, and that became important later on. But because this outbreak occurred, because he was notified of cases of cholera, he was able to put his theory into test. And he went out and did something which to us today makes absolute common sense, but at the time was really radical. What Snow did is he went out into the areas it was affected, and he knocked on the doors of the houses, and he interviewed the people who'd survived. And he asked them questions like, where did you get your water from? How many people lived in the house? Who died? He talked to people and tried to get information off them. And remember, and we go back to our picture of the pump in the beginning, remember at this time, people didn't have piped water into their houses. So you didn't have a tap that you'd turn on and get water from. If you wanted water, what you'd have to do is get a jug or a bowl, go out your house, into the street, find the nearest water pump and pump the water into your jug or your bowl and then bring it back to your house. So there wasn't individual supplies. Excuse me. Communities would all use the same water pump in the street. And this is what Snow did. Snow made this map. Now the red dot is where the pump is. The pump. It's not a brilliant picture, but this is Broad Street. And we can see the pump is roughly in the middle of Broad Street. And these black lines that we can see, each of these lines represents a death in a property. So Snow is recording not only where people died, but how many people died as well. But when he was doing his investigation, he found a number of interesting things. First one is that there were no deaths, linked to people who worked in the local brewery. There's the brewery, there's the pump. But none of the people who worked there got ill. No one died. He also found that in the local workhouse, there were very few deaths. Now, we have to remember what the workhouse was at this time was an institution. There was no social care, if you like. There were no sort of social services available to people. There was sort of charity in a sense. If you were absolutely destitute, you could fall back on the charity of your local area. But the sort of overriding ethos at the time was you would make that charity so hard and so horrible that it really was the place of last resort. So no one wanted to go into the workhouse. Not only was it sort of shameful, but they were pretty appalling places to go. But there were several hundred people in this workhouse. Probably those people who are probably the most vulnerable to illness, but relatively speaking, very few deaths. And Snow also found that there were people dying of cholera outside of this sort of immediate area. That, whilst it appears most people are focused within this area, there were the odd one or two who died of cholera outside, and they were the only people in their area who had died of cholera. And finally, he found that of all the residents in Broad Street, young people seemed to suffer the most. They were the ones that seemed to be affected the most with cholera. So we have to think about answers to these questions. Why did these things happen? And can we explain it in terms of Snow's theory around water and the Broad Street pump? Well, we can, and Snow did. Because what he found is that there were no deaths in the brewery for the simple fact that everybody working in the brewery drank the beer. In fact, they were paid in beer. So there was no need for them to go to the pump because they had beer to drink. And the brewing process was killing off the pathogenic organism in the cholera that was causing illness. Now, they didn't know this at the time, but this is why. The workhouse, Snow found that the workhouse had its own separate pump. And therefore, not many of the residents of the workhouse actually went to Broad Street and drank from it. They all drank from the pump in the workhouse. And the explanation as to why some people outside of the area. Well, when Snow talked to the family of the people who were ill and had died but didn't live near Broad Street, what he found was this, that there was a grandmother in the family, and the grandmother had for many, many years lived in Broad Street. And then the family had got a bit more wealthy and moved out of that area. But the grandmother liked the taste of the Broad Street water. She didn't like the taste of the water from the pump that was closest to her new house. So what she would do is she would ask her family to walk to Broad Street to get a jug of water for her because that's the water she liked. And the final question, why are young people seeming to suffer more? Well, it's quite simple, really, because young people were asked to go to the pump. If you have a family living in Broad Street, one of the duties of the children would be to go to the pump on behalf of the family and draw water and bring it back. And what Snow found is that young people, when they were going to the pump, would always have a drink from the pump as well. So they were actually consuming more water from this pump than any other member of their family, and therefore the risk was greater to them, and therefore they suffered more. Snow also produced another map, and this is an even better map to produce. And again, what we can see here is we can see Broad Street in the middle, and we can see the pump. And this grey line, this wiggly line round the outside, what Snow did is he paced out the distance. And everywhere inside this grey line means that the Broad Street pump is the closest pump by walking distance. Anything outside of this line means there is another pump closer to that property. So if we sort of look in Little Chapel Street up here, there were pumps closer to Little Chapel Street than Broad Street, which means that if you lived in Little Chapel Street, you would go somewhere else. You wouldn't automatically go to Broad Street. If you lived in, Edward Street, this is the closest pump. You wouldn't necessarily go somewhere else. And what we can see from Snow's map is that the vast majority of cases lie within that space. They lie within the closest walking distance to Broad Street pump. Obviously, there are some people outside. We accept that. Maybe they wandered in, or they were cross-contaminated from other people. But most of the cases that we found, or what Snow found, were in walking distance from the pump. And that is the pump that people would use. And this is what's known as shoe leather epidemiology. It allowed Snow to produce a map of death that shows that link between the water and deaths and the cases of cholera. And he did further investigations. Not only did he then pin down the pump, but he was able to prove that the water from the pump was being contaminated from the cesspools provided for the houses on Broad Street. So what was happening, there was a pipe bringing water into the Broad Street pump that had cracked. Now remember, at the start we talked about the overcrowding, the conditions that people lived in, and the toilet facilities. They had cesspools. There was no main drainage. Their sewage just leaked into the ground. And that's what was happening. Because that pipe was cracked, the leakage from those cesspools could enter the water supply. In fact, what Snow did, he was able to trace it to the first case. And it turned out the first case in Broad Street was a small child, was a baby who had had cholera, obviously picked it up from elsewhere, but had brought it back to Broad Street. And the mother had been washing the nappies, the contaminated nappies from the baby, and that water had gone into the cesspool, which had then gone into the pump, which had caused the outbreak in Broad Street. And remember, we find this out before we know what the organism is that causes cholera. We didn't know what caused it. So Snow presented his results to the local health board, and they arranged for the pump handle to be removed. Obviously to stop the source of the problem. Now, there's an urban myth that John Snow himself went down to Broad Street in the middle of the night and stole the pump handle away. It's a lovely story, but it is actually an urban myth, I'm afraid. I mean, by the time the pump handle was actually removed, by the time Snow had gathered all his data and convinced people to take this action, the outbreak was starting to reduce. And part of the reason it started to reduce is people were leaving Broad Street. They were frightened. They moved away out of that area. And because there are fewer people there are fewer people to get ill and die, there are fewer people to transmit the illness. But what it did is it led to changes in the way water is brought into people, and it led to changes in the way we get rid of sewage. And this is a major environmental health and public health breakthrough. In fact, if we look through the history of time, the thing that has saved more lives, the thing that has improved our health the most, is nothing medical whatsoever. It isn't a drug, it isn't a treatment, it isn't a doctor. It's sanitation. And sanitation is the greatest thing. It has made man prosper. That's what saves lives. And again, I keep going back to this. It's really important to understand that, Snow made these breakthroughs. Snow was able to establish these things without knowing what caused cholera. It would be another 10 years or so before people identified the bacteria. So Snow's conclusions were made purely on the basis of observational data. And it shows that we don't necessarily need to know every detail of a disease to prevent it. That rings true for coronavirus. We knew it was coming. We could see it. We knew the symptoms. We had an idea of what it was, but we didn't need to know the full details to find out how to control it. In Snow's time, there was political and social pressure to prevent the effective use of evidence. People still said, when Snow stood up and said, I think it's the water and here's my evidence, people said, oh no, it can't be right. It's miasma, because that's what we think. And again, this has resonance with coronavirus today. People who deny the coronavirus exists, people who think that certain measures are not effective or certain other measures are effective. It's still something that public health is fighting today. This battle of common sense, if you like. And it also shows the importance of dealing with public health issues at a local level. Snow lived near this area. He lived on the edge of Broad Street in this slum area. He lived on the edge. He knew the people. He knew the area. He knew what was going on. And more importantly, the people trusted him. He was a renowned figure. He was a figure of importance and respect. So when Snow went into their houses and asked questions, people answered them. And again, this shows how important public health is when it's delivered at a local level. We could again draw comparisons with coronavirus, test and trace systems, national systems, working better now, but at one point we're sort of hitting 60% of people being contacted. That was the national scheme. Local schemes put in by local public and environmental health teams were hitting 98%. And it is all about that local connection. If I'm in Liverpool and the person who phones me from the National Trace Centre is in Norwich, they have no investment in what happens in Liverpool. They've got no interest. So why should they bother? Why should be as thorough? But if someone from Liverpool phones me up, they are interested. They have a stake in what happens in Liverpool. They can understand where I'm coming from. I will trust them because it's a Liverpool phone number. It might be a Liverpool accent. And we will trust local people far more than we will anybody else. So it is incredibly important to remember that, this was public health measures put in to control cholera. And this is the beginning of epidemiology, public health epidemiology. We are still taking these lessons from Snow and using them today in dealing with coronavirus. And that is really important because it is public health measures that has kept us safe. Hand washing, social distancing, face coverings, self-isolation. These are all public health measures that have been brought in. And certainly in the early days of the pandemic, this is what's kept us all alive. So this is why public and environmental health is so important. So I hope you found today's webinar really useful. If you'd like to find out more about our Lightning Lunch series, there is the link there. We've also set a new web page for students. And again, if you have any questions, please try and don't be afraid to contact our outreach team. I'm going to hand over to Karen, who works on outreach, just in case I've forgotten any key information about it.
You covered everything well. Well, thank you so much, Graham, for that fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. As Graham mentioned, this is the third in a range of Lightning Lunch sessions. So if you are interested in any of the other sessions, then do go along to our webpage, which is www.ljmu.ac.uk outreach events. And a copy of this recording will be on that website as well. I've noticed there are no questions, Graham, so I think we're fine to leave it here. Thank you again, and thank you to our audience. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.